Hello class, my name is Julia Luz. This is my presentation on tourism and disaster. What we will cover in this presentation will begin with keywords, then the importance of tourism and disaster, effects of disaster in tourism, emergency management in tourism, example of tourism disaster management, a case study, and the conclusion to this entire presentation. The keywords are, of course, tourism and disaster. So we understand tourism as the traveling places, getting to know places, the leisure activity, but it's a much bigger term. This is the definition from the World Tourism Organization. Tourism that takes full account of its current and future economic, social, and environmental impact, addressing the needs of visitors, the industry, the environment, and host communities. Then disaster, an event that exceeds the emergency response and recovery capabilities and resources of the agencies and officials responsible for its management in one or more critical area of response or recovery. So let's begin. The importance of disaster in tourism. Tourism and travel are one of the world's greatest industries and popular global leisure activity. Tourism is also one of the most important economic sectors for most nations. Tourism creates jobs. We need to keep that in mind, which is a big part of many countries in the economy. Disaster is natural, man-made, or technological, resulting in an event of great extent, causing significant physical damage, destruction, loss of life, or a change in environment. This is why it's so impactful, and we must keep in mind disasters can happen and the effects and consequences later on. No tourist destination is immune to such crises. A few examples of the disasters that can affect tourists anywhere, and even if you're not a tourist somewhere, are hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, landslides, tsunamis, storms, even terrorist attack, political instabilities, economic recessions are all things that could affect visitors somewhere. Effects of disaster on tourism. So these are a few of the most important ones I selected. There is significant decline in visitors going to a location after a disaster occurs there. This is because it is now viewed as risky and dangerous. There's an economic drop due to the lack of tourist income. There's usually an increase in travel insurance. There's a lot of physical damage and destruction to the area, and there's a lot of negative media publicity. So disaster management and tourism. Disaster management, emergency management, is the discipline of dealing with and avoiding both natural and man-made disaster. It involves preparedness, response, and recovery in order to lessen the impact of disasters overall. Disasters are seen as a consequence of inappropriately managed risks, therefore a combination of hazards and vulnerabilities. Next, I will show a few examples I found that facilitate disaster management. So from the article, Role of Tourism in Disaster Management Strategies, I was able to find this process. It's called the Ingredients for a Tourism Disaster Management Planning Process. It assesses points that are extremely important when dealing with a disaster, and how to facilitate the process and the event of a disaster in the case it happens. So there is risk assessment, prioritization, a protocol. So protocol, for example, ensures that activities of emergency management agencies, tourism authority, and operators are properly coordinated, and it involves like regulations. Then there's community capacity audits. There is Disaster Management Command Center, media and monitoring activity, which is basically media communication strategies, warning systems, because a system for communicating a warning is extremely important, and flexibility, involvement, education, and review. So all of these, I believe, should be assessed. Next, another example, I found on the Belize Ministry of Tourism website a tourism program that the country of Belize has. It's called Sustainable Tourism Program 2, which is most likely a second version, more improved, of the program 1. So it consists of 3 components. The first one is enhancement of the tourism product. This includes enhancement of archaeological sites, natural attractions improved and developed, enhancement of waterfronts and basic infrastructures. Component 2, disaster and climate resilient destinations. This one is composed of national guidelines for disaster preparedness and climate resilience for tourism, improved destination crisis management, Toledo Tourism Disaster and Climate Resilience Plan. And then finally, the third one, component 3, is institutional strengthening and capacity building. This one consists of tourism information collection and analysis capacity improved, policy and legislation improved development, destination planning and management improved, and so on. So I believe this is a well made program, and it reaches all the most important aspects of tourism for this country and disaster and etc. So the case study I found extremely significant and stood out to me was Nepal. It was based on the devastating earthquakes of April 2015 and its aftershocks. And natural disasters are extremely common in Nepal. Over 8,790 casualties and 22,300 people were injured after the specific earthquake. Nepal's tourism sector suffered extreme losses. It was worth an estimate of $7 billion in the aftermath of loss. The earthquake affected about 2,900 structures with a cultural and religious heritage value, which is an extreme loss for the cultural aspect of the country, and that's something that attracts tourists because they are interested in such structures. This reduced the number of tourists for the next few years. A reduction in tourist spending per day went from $43 a day to $35, which is a significant effect in revenue. So the negative repercussions that came with the disasters were extremely significant for this country. So I believe this is a good example of how tourism and disaster can be interlaced and the effects of such. Social tourism is an act of traveling to a disaster area as a matter of curiosity and generosity that ultimately gives people satisfaction. There are good and bad things that come with social tourism. For example, Nepal, now that it is on the low with tourism, social tourism will come in handy as they will help bring Nepal back up. Examples of social tourism are disaster tourism, volunteering tourism, cultural tourism, educational tourism, medical and relief tourism, and others. So finally, to conclude, disaster management, as we've learned, has to be a multidisciplinary and proactive process within the tourism industry and the country. In order to move towards safer and more sustainable national development in tourism, countries should be more sensitive and give more attention towards disaster mitigation, disaster preparedness, and training. The vulnerabilities represented to the tourism industry require significant investment, so countries must give this the full attention it needs. My last piece of advice and suggestion when it comes to tourism, disaster, and traveling is, in my personal opinion, we should fear disasters in places, but I still have the interest of going somewhere regardless of the risks of disasters there. So just prepare yourself before going somewhere. Do your research. Every place should have a informative website to explain these things. I have linked at the bottom on the presentation the website that Florida has. If you go to Visit Florida, there is a crisis preparation link, and there it tells you the various crises and disasters that could affect Florida and what to do in the event, how to prepare yourself, and I believe that's very useful. So thank you for listening. I hope this was informative. And finally, I have my bibliography, and I hope you all have a good day. Thank you.